Let me just tell you a little bit about myself and this webinar series. So normally I run this webinar series with my close colleague and friend, Dr. Sarah Bullock. Unfortunately, she can't be with us today, so it's just me. Normally she would be giving an introduction for me, but unfortunately she can't be here, so I have to introduce myself, but that's okay. I will now get on to the business of the day, which is to start discussing the benefits of using CAQDAS packages, qualitative software programs, for reflection and reflexivity in qualitative analysis. And this is something that is quite close to my heart. It's something that I've reflected on over the past 25 years when I've been engaging with these programs. And I want to share with you today some reflections about how I see that the use of these kinds of digital tools can actually enhance the way we think about enacting reflection and reflexivity in our practice. So the core topics that I will discuss today, I've kind of thematized. So first of all, I want to make a few comments about the context into which this particular discussion finds its place. So I'll make a few comments about the benefits of using qualitative software CAQDAS packages generally, okay? And then I will make a few comments around terminology, in which I will distinguish between reflection and reflexivity. Okay, that's not something that's always distinguished in the literature, but I think it's useful to distinguish that. So I want to have a little bit of a terminological conversation. And then I want to talk about the centrality of those activities, reflection and reflexivity, in qualitative data analysis more generally. So that's going to be a few little conversations about method. And then from there, I really want to talk about the tools. So what tools do we have available within CAQDAS packages that can facilitate the tasks of reflection and reflexivity? And then I'm going to finish off the session today reflecting on why all of this matters. Okay, and that will involve having a little bit of a discussion about quality. Okay, so let's get started. So I want to talk generally about the benefits of using bespoke or dedicated CAQDAS packages for qualitative and mixed methods analysis, rather than working manually or using non-dedicated digital tools like Excel or Microsoft Word that many people use. And for me, the core benefit of using a dedicated software program is that it is what I would call a garden shed. It's a toolbox, okay? It's a container that allows us to store and connect everything that we're working with for our given research project, okay? And that sense of thinking about the software project as a container is really important, because the interconnectivity that enables is something that's not possible if you're using software that hasn't been designed for the purpose, and also really difficult when you're working manually with bits and pieces of paper all over the place. So for me, that's really a project management aspect. Yeah, it's about managing the data, managing the storage, not just of the data, but of your ideas that you have about the data, and also classifying the important information and ideas that you have about those data. So at the basic level, the sense in which you can think about the use of qualitative software as a container, as a garden shed, as a toolbox is really, really important, and a core benefit over and above other tools that we might use. Leading on from that is the idea that within that container, the software developers have designed lots of tools specifically for qualitative analysis. Okay, so yes, we can do various qualitative analysis tasks using other software programs that haven't been designed for the purpose. But as soon as you start using a tool that has been designed for the purpose, you start to get finer tools for your particular tasks. And the kind of end point of that, or the most benefit of that, is that we have very sophisticated ways to identify patterns, relationships, and anomalies in our data. And on some level, that's what we're all in the business of doing when we're doing qualitative or mixed methods analysis. And it's those kinds of searching, querying, interrogation tools that these kinds of programs have embedded within them that really move them beyond what is possible elsewhere. But also there are tools for visualizing and reporting. And the idea of visualizing the findings from qualitative and mixed methods analysis is something that's receiving a lot more attention in the last few years. And many of these programs have really innovative and creative ways of visualizing qualitative data and the analysis that we do with qualitative data beyond the standard paragraph of text, 3 examples of quotes, and then another paragraph of text. So some of those visualizations are something that are really, really important. And then finally, that idea of quality. Okay, so I'll talk about quality towards the end of the session today in more detail, but of course, it's true that you can do good quality analysis without using dedicated CAQDAS packages, definitely. And also you can do bad analysis when you do use them. So the point about quality is more about illustrating your quality. As soon as I use a CAQDAS package, I can illustrate what I've done, and that allows me to show other people what how I've got from my data to my interpretation. So it's the illustration of quality rather than the quality itself that's the key point there. Okay, so in my mind, those are the key high-level benefits of using CAQDAS packages. And that really all boils down to the idea of access. Okay, so this idea of a garden shed or a container or a toolbox is all about access. I can access the data through that container. I can access the ideas that I have about that data through the container. And also I can share with others what I've done. Okay, so for me, that idea of the container is really to do with access. So I could talk about that for many hours, but I'm not going to talk about that for many hours today because I've got other things to talk about. But if you like that idea about access and want to explore that in a little bit more detail, then there is a blog post that I've written around access that you might want to tap into. Okay, so that's the first little bit of context, just to give us the frame for which I want to make the comments today about using these tools for reflection and reflexivity. And as I said earlier, I think it's very useful to distinguish between reflection and reflexivity. And actually, those two terms, reflection and reflexivity, they're often used interchangeably in the literature. So often authors and researchers will use reflection and reflexivity to mean the same thing, essentially. But I think it's quite useful to differentiate them. So I just want to make a few comments about that. And actually, I'm not the only one who thinks about that. So this is a quote from 20 years ago, Finlay and Goff, who say that reflection can be defined as thinking about something after the event, whereas reflexivity, in contrast, involves a more immediate, dynamic, and continuing self-awareness. So in that distinction, they are talking about when it happens, yes? The reflection happens after, and the reflexivity happens as a continual process. And that's quite a useful distinction, but I'm also interested not only in the when of the distinction, but the what of the distinction. So what is different about reflection and reflexivity? So I want to make a few comments about that. So first of all, just a few definitions about reflexivity. So this is a definition from Berger, 2015, who says that reflexivity recognizes and takes responsibility for our own situatedness within the research, okay, and the effect that it may have on the setting and the people being studied. the questions being asked, the data being collected, and the interpretation of the data. So for me, the key points here are those terms, the situatedness, okay, and the effect that that has on everything else that happens. So that's to do with who we are as researchers and how we situate ourselves in the context of our research and how that has an effect on what we are doing. Let's have a look at another definition. There are multiple definitions of reflexivity out there, and one of the issues I think in qualitative methods more generally is terminology. So qualitative researchers are often using the same term to mean different things, or different terms to mean the same things, and that's something that we just have to navigate as qualitative researchers. But here's another rather long definition of reflexivity from Halagnas and colleagues from 2017, who say, through reflexivity, researchers acknowledge the changes brought about in themselves as a result of the research process and how those changes affect the research process. So that's slightly different from the previous one, yes? So this is about thinking about a dialectic, that the research is having an effect on me as a researcher, as well as my positionality and my background having an effect on the research itself. So they say the journey of discovering how researchers shaped and how they were shaped by the research process and output is an iterative and empowering process, more so when their positionalities are challenged and the researchers acknowledge that reflexivity should be recognized as a significant part of the research findings. So there's many additional layers going on in this definition. The ones I want to pick out right now is the idea about that dialectic, yes? So the idea that reflexivity, according to this definition, is about how me as a researcher and my colleagues as a researcher is affecting the process, but also that I am potentially being affected by the process myself, okay? And also this idea that reflexivity itself, okay, should be and is a significant part of the findings. So it's not just about the process, it's also about the findings. And I think that's a really important thing to reflect upon. I've just noticed Sharon's question in the chat. Yes, I will share the slides with you, no problem. Okay, so there are many other definitions of reflexivity. And at the end, my final slide has got some references that you might want to tap into. But I want to make a broader point about positionality and situatedness and all of that in the context of what I see as a spectrum of analytic approaches in the qualitative space. Okay, so let's just think about paradigms and positions and methodologies. So on one end of a spectrum, and this spectrum is fluid, okay, it's not meant to be set in stone or concrete, but on one, where have I gone? I've gone backwards instead of forwards. Where am I? Here I am. Okay. On one end of the spectrum, okay, we have relativism, interpretivism, constructivism. Okay, so thinking about epistemology and ontology, we have very purist, if you like, qualitative approaches when context is really important and when we prize the subjective interpretation of our data, when we are interested in immersing in our data in a very in-depth way. We want to be close to our data all the time. We're interested in meaning. We want to generate credible interpretations. So we're interested in understanding and trustworthiness. And this is on one end of a methodological spectrum, okay? And much qualitative research sits in that space, okay? But on the other end of the spectrum are other ways of thinking about the world and other ways of thinking about how we gain knowledge about the world, which are much more what we might consider as essentially positivist ways of thinking about the world. So realism, empiricism, quantitative approaches, when we want to measure and be objective about what we are observing, and ideas about validity, reliability, fact rather than meaning, etc., is what's happening in that space. Okay. And the point that I want to make here is not only that with between those two is the kind of pluralist way of thinking about things, when we might be more experimental, we might be taking a mixed methods approach, we might want to be adapting these different ways of thinking about things in a more flexible way. My real point is that across that spectrum, researchers are using qualitative data. Okay, so qualitative data is not, sitting on the left-hand side of this spectrum. Okay, although many people would say qualitative research sits on that purest end of my spectrum, qualitative data is used across the whole spectrum. Okay, and I think that's really, really important, because qualitative research is not a homogeneous activity. Okay, people who are sitting in the positivist and the pluralist spaces are also working with qualitative data, and they're thinking quite differently about it from those who are at the purest end. And for me, it's not a better or worse thing, it's just a different thing. Okay, now not everybody would agree with that. Some people sit very entrenched in one particular place or other, and that's fine. But for me, I think it's really important when we're thinking about software tools that we're thinking about opening up the possibilities across this idea of the spectrum. Because if I'm on the positive end of this spectrum, I can analyze qualitative data in a very quantitative way. I can measure things that are occurring within qualitative data. Okay, and that's not better than what I might do on the other end, or worse, it's just different. Okay, but it's not just the data, it's also the analytic methods. So analytic methods, there are many, many, many different analytic methods for how we go about analyzing qualitative data that span this spectrum. Okay, and indeed, there are many research projects and researchers who will look at one body of data from multiple different analytic methods. Okay, in order to take a mixed methods analysis approach. Okay, so mixed methods can be thought about in terms of the data. Am I using qualitative and quantitative data? That's mixing data, okay, which is often what is discussed in mixed methods research designs. But software allows us to mix analytic methods, so we can have one set of data and look at it from a methods perspective in a different way, in multiple different ways. And also we have tools. Okay, so some qualitative software tools sit in more on one end of the spectrum or more on the other end of the spectrum, and some are designed to allow us as researchers to transcend across this. So they're much more pluralist in their design. And in that context, I think it's really important that I reference Stuart Shulman, whose software is very much designed from that pluralist perspective. And this idea that I'm talking about now about the spectrum is a combination of his work and my own work with my colleague Anne Lewins. Okay, so you might all be thinking, what's this got to do with reflexivity and reflection? Okay, my point, okay, about this is that here, reflexivity is really important. Okay, so remembering the idea that reflexivity is about thinking about our role as researchers on the research process and the dialectic the other way. Okay, that's something that's highly prized, particularly in the purist end of the spectrum, but also in the pluralist end. But I would argue that the idea of reflection happens across the whole of this spectrum. So if I'm in the more positivist end, okay, I still reflect on what I do. I still think about the variables that I'm working with. I still think about the measurements that I'm doing. Okay, but I just do that in a different way from how I might do it if I was being reflexive about it. Yes, because on that end of the spectrum, I'm trying to reduce bias, I'm trying to be objective, I'm trying to make sure that I'm not having an influence on what I'm doing. Okay, but that's still reflection, but not reflexivity, right? Because I'm trying to mitigate that influence. And that's why I think, for me, it's important to distinguish between reflection, that I would argue every researcher does, and reflexivity, which is just one aspect of reflection that some qualitative researchers engage in, depending on where they're sitting in the methodological space. So, summary of all of that is that researchers always reflect. Some researchers are reflexive in their reflection. Okay, so therefore the what of the difference, which is what I was alluding to earlier, involves thinking about reflection, involves thinking about all aspects of a project as part of a methodological process. And I would argue that everybody does that across the spectrum, whereas reflexivity is additionally about being aware of and examining ourselves as researchers in the process, and in particular the influence of our background, assumptions, etc., but also how it affects us. Okay, and that's not something that all researchers would be thinking about, but all researchers would be thinking about all aspects of the research design and all of those analytic aspects. Okay, so I guess I've sort of said this already. But I would very much see reflection as ubiquitous in research. Okay, so it's important for all research studies, and some qualitative researchers are reflexive as part of their reflective process or practice, but not all. And what I'm now going to move on to think about is how CAQDAS packages, qualitative software, can be useful across the methodological spectrum, and in particular, they have many spaces where reflections can be made, whether they are reflexive reflections or not. Okay, so let's just layer this up a little bit and start making it a little bit more concrete in terms of software. Okay, so some of you may be aware of the work I've done around what I call the high-level analytic activities that we all engage in when we're working with qualitative materials. So across that spectrum, I would argue that there are certain high-level analytic activities that we all engage in. And I name these integration, organization, exploration, interrogation, and reflection. Okay, reflexivity being part of reflection for some of us. And if you want to know more about those different activities, then there is a blog post that you can read. It's also in various of my textbooks, but I'll just pop the blog post into the chat in case anybody wants to check that out later. But in this, you can't see the diagram very well, but in the diagram, okay, which has these high-level activities, reflection is in the center, okay, and that's what I want to talk about today. And the reason it's in the center is because of what I've been discussing, the idea that we all reflect on everything that we do, okay. And I find it useful in my own work and when I'm teaching qualitative methods and tools to distinguish between reflection in terms of the focus of our reflections and the form of our reflections. So the focus of reflections basically is what we are reflecting on, okay? And I would argue that we reflect on the data themselves, we reflect on the concepts that we're using to understand our data, we reflect on the processes that we're going through in order to do our analysis, and we reflect on our growing interpretations as they happen. And I think all of those four happen across that methodological spectrum. The researcher role bit at the top is the reflexivity bit. So in my mind, reflexivity is one aspect of reflection. Okay, really important in many qualitative projects, but not in all. Whereas the form, okay, which is really what I want to talk about for the rest of this session, is to do with how we capture those reflections. And that's where the software comes in. And I want to talk today for the remainder of the time about the spaces that we have in CAQDAS packages that are designed to capture reflections, okay? And I'm going to talk about linking, writing, and mapping as key ways or spaces, forms of capturing those reflections. Okay, let me just have a drink. So, linking, writing, mapping. Let's talk about linking first. And actually, linking is the kind of core process essentially in CAQDAS packages, because CAQDAS packages are relational databases. So everything is about linking. Okay, so coding essentially is a linking process as well. Okay, so for example, if these are two transcripts, okay, they happen to be looking like textual transcripts of interviews or something, but the same would be true if it was a video or an image or whatever. We may decide that parts of this data source are related to a particular theme, okay, which is what we typically call a code, okay? And a code may be used to represent a theme or a topic or an idea or a concept or a category, whatever our method wants to call it. So essentially, the coding process in these programs is a linking process. So I create a code and I name it and I define it probably, and then I link it to the bits of data that I think is an instance of it. And I can do that in lots of different places, and I can have overlaps, and I can have as many codes as I want. And when I've started linking, coding via that linking process, I can open up one of those codes and just see the bits of data that I've put in there. So that's the essential tagging or coding process in all of these qualitative software programs. And that's really, really useful. Okay. But when I code, so those two segments of data there that I've coded to my well-being code, I'm basically saying when I'm coding, this bit of data is an instance of well-being. It's about well-being. It's a kind of well-being. It's something to do with well-being. And so is the next bit, and so is the next bit, and so is the next bit. Great. That's really useful for many, many purposes. But what I'm not doing when I'm coding in that way is making any kind of statement about the relationship between the two or more instances of that well-being code. So for example, if this transcript that we're looking at here now on the right-hand side is the transcript of an interview with somebody, let's call him Frank, okay, and he says something at the beginning of the transcript about well-being, and then he says something later on about well-being as well, but he's contradicting himself, then that's very difficult to capture by coding. Okay, both of those statements need to be coded at well-being because they're both about well-being. But if he's contradicting in the second bit what he said earlier, then I can't capture that very easily by coding. Okay, and that's what I mean by linking in CAQDAS packages. So although coding is a linking activity, linking is a different sort of thing in terminological sense within many of these software programs. And I can link between two data segments, as is illustrated by this red dotted link here. And I can do that across data files as well. So it needn't be only within one data file. It can be across data files. And I can also link codes to one another as well, which is a higher level of saying this is related to that on a conceptual level rather than a data level. So that's something that we often talk about, the levels at which we work. But can you see how linking is capturing a reflection? Coding is capturing reflection too, isn't it? When I code, I'm basically saying this is about that, and that's capturing my analytic reflections about the data. But linking is another way of capturing reflections. And in some CAQDAS packages, it's possible to label those links so that I can capture the nature of the relationship between the things that I'm linking. So my general point, I guess, is that coding is a form of linking, but an additional layer of linking is thinking about linking data themselves and linking codes themselves. So linking within the levels at which we work analytically rather than across the levels, which is basically what's happening when we're coding. Okay. So if you're interested in that idea and want to get more info about it, I did a sort of 10-minute video just about that little topic, the difference between coding and linking in qualitative analysis, qualitative data analysis and software. So I'll pop that into the chat for you as well, in case you want to kind of think about that in a little bit more detail than I've been able to do today. But what I wanted to show you was one software that is really excellent at that kind of linking. Okay, so just to be clear, the coding process, this is about that. This is about that. All of the CAQDAS packages are really excellent at that. They're all designed and have very highly refined coding tools, but some of them have more refined linking tools in the way that I've just described it than others. And Atlas TI probably would be the one that I would say at the moment has the highest refined level of linking tools. And here you can see an example of a network in Atlas TI. This is actually some data. It's an advert about Coca-Cola. So you can see the images in there. They're actually clips of a commercial, which have been coded to a code. This is the code here. The code's called female gaze. So each of these is coded to that code. But some of them, for example, this one here, these two instances of that code are also being linked to one another. And Atlas TI has default relationships that you can use. So you can say this criticizes or contradicts or expands, or you can create your own labels for the nature of the link between the segments. So that's an illustration of that idea of linking. And so for me, linking is a really important way of capturing the reflections that I have about the bits of data that I'm coding. And that's another level or layer of analytic work. Before I move on, I want to say something else about coding, okay, which is that coding in some programs is not just about tagging the data according to a label. It's also about visually annotating the data. And again, some programs are much more refined in the functionality they provide for this sort of thing. Transana, for example, has the ability to on top of images to create user defined shapes and colors and different tools for marking up visual images. So this is a photograph of me and my daughter in the sea last summer, actually. And when you're working with visual materials, then it may be that you want to capture some kind of interaction or something that's happening that's maybe difficult to capture by just labeling a code. So this is just another example of how actually what I'm doing here is capturing my reflections about what's going on by marking the data in a visual way. Okay, and in Transana, that's a form of coding. Okay, a visual annotation. All right, so that's a little bit of discussion about linking as a means of capturing reflections. Okay, I also want to make some comments about writing. Okay, so this is a diagram that I meant to animate and show you different bits one at a time, but I've obviously forgotten. So in a piece of data in a CAQDAS package, okay, there are always many different writing spaces, okay, and those writing spaces have different names depending on which software you're working with. But for me, the sense that not only can I write within a CAQDAS package, but I can link my writing to the data that prompted my writing. That's the bit that's the important bit. Okay, so when I'm doing analysis, if I'm not using a dedicated software program, I can write lots of notes on bits of paper. Fine, that's okay. I've then got to remember to read those bits of paper again, which frankly, I'm not very good at. But if I use a software program, I can attach the reflections that I'm having, whether they're reflexive reflections or not, to the bit of data that prompted it. Okay, so this is just an example of the range of different places that you can stick notes to. So you can have notes which are completely freestanding. Okay, so for example, I will always recommend in a software training session, whichever program we're teaching, that you have at least some freestanding memos, at least one memo for the research question. Sometimes people will have multiple freestanding memos for each 3 or 4 different research questions, maybe. So you've got a space where you can write your plan for how you're going to answer the research question, and then also start to answer your research question in that space. And that might not be linked to anything, but you can link a writing space, which is sometimes called a memo or an appraisal or a summary, to a whole data source. So this could be writing about that whole interview transcript, or that whole image, or that whole film, or whatever it is. Yes. So summarizing the whole data source. You can also stick a memo at a code. So as well as defining what well-being means, I can also start to write my interpretations about how well-being is being experienced by my participants in a memo or a summary that is linked to the code. If I link that code to another code, then I can also stick a memo or an annotation on the link and explain what that link is doing and how and why I've created it. I can also stick a little note on a coded segment. So this is a segment of data that's been coded to meditation. That's because I can see that because it's purple. And I could say, okay, this is not just my comments about the code, but about this instance of the code. Basically, I can stick notes wherever I want to. Okay. And for me, that's one of the primary reasons why I would use a software package like it, like the ones that we talk about in this genre of CAQDAS, because not only can I take my ideas out of my mind. Okay, if I leave the thoughts, we have so many thoughts, don't we, when we're doing qualitative analysis, and we think that we're going to remember that, oh, I won't forget that, but you do forget it. If you leave it in your head, it's gone fairly quickly. If you put it on a piece of paper, it's not gone if you remember to go and read that piece of paper again. Okay, if you put it in your qualitative software and link it to the data that prompted the thought, then every time you look at that piece of data again, the thought that you had 3 months ago or 2 weeks ago or yesterday or whenever is there to be reminded, and you can build on it. And then your interpretation of the data is iteratively layered up. And for me, that's the key reason why I use these programs. Let me just show you a couple of illustrations. These are illustrations from 2 different software programs. So Quirkos on the top left. Okay, so this is some field note data that I made many years ago when I was observing myself teach. So I was thinking about improving my teaching, and I made some notes and I started to analyze that to help me improve my practice. So this is data is coded. So these stripes, these vertical stripes, are representing different codes, learning technologies, reflective practices, teacher learning interaction. But I've also put memos associated with those, and I can see both the data and the memos at the same time. Really nice display. F for analyze does the same thing, but you're really embedding the memos that you write in the text. So the text here is respondent. This is an interview, I think. And the memos are these yellow highlighted bits which go into the text, and you can hide and reveal them. So if you don't want to see your memos when you're reading the transcript, you can hide them. That's great. But you can also code your own writing together, embedded within the data. And those of you that are interested in reflexivity and thinking about your role and how you're interpreting the data, that's super, super, super powerful. So just a couple of examples there. All right, I'm running out of time, so let's move on to mapping. So that was my third form of reflection in terms of what software allows us, and it's useful to differentiate between mind mapping and concept mapping, but also in terms of the purpose that we put mapping to in these software programs. So are we mapping as interrogation? So are we mapping in the software in order to reveal what's going on? Or are we mapping as interpretation or presentation? So it's not just the type of mapping that we might be doing, mind and concept mapping being two key types of mapping that are talked about in the qualitative methods, but the purpose for the mapping within the software in terms of what mapping functionality provides are usefully distinguished as interrogation, as interpretation, and as presentation. So let me just give you a few examples. This is a mind map from NVivo, actually, about my PhD project, which I did many, many years ago. But mind maps always have one central idea, which here is young people. And I was interested in the family context, the country of residence, and their learning. And so I was just mapping out in a kind of structural way my ideas about what I wanted to focus on before I started gathering data even. Okay. And mind mapping in that way can be really, really helpful to capture your thoughts about the structures of your project. Later on, you start to want to create maps to represent your findings. So this is an example adapted from one of the examples in one of my my other textbooks. This is a project about bullying, when we are mapping out the process in a more kind of refined way. So the initial mind map I showed you was just kind of quick brainstorming. What am I interested in? Whereas this one is a bit more, okay, this is showing much more about the process of the project and thinking about how I might go about the process. So what's the context of bullying? So little different aspects we might be interested in, thinking about teachers' definitions, the different episodes, etc. But also within software, as well as having these abstract ideas, you can also put in many of these programs the actual extracts of data that are illustrative of what's something that you're showing in a map. So here, for example, when we're talking about interventions to prevent bullying, here's an extract from the data. So you can, using software, you can really fully integrate your reflections and with the data and the high level overview of what's going on. So that's just a little bit of a distinction between mind mapping and concept mapping. But these software programs also allow us to ask the software, okay, tell me, those two examples were of the researcher building their own map to represent some aspect of their thinking, right? Which is super useful. But in software, we can say, tell me what's connected according to the work that I've previously done. So show me, yeah? And that's what I mean by mapping as interrogation, not build my own maps according to what's going on in my head interpretively, but show me what's going on in my project, in my data, according to the coding and other work I might have done. Okay, and that can be done in a whole range of different ways related to the connections that we've made through linking, coding, and also classifying, you know, the socio-demographic characteristics of our participants or whatever it might be. So here's an example from NVivo. In these yellow blobs here are two codes. Okay, again, this is from my PhD. One big code, moral discourses, and the other code about young women. And in the middle are all the data files where both of those themes are common. So all of those data files are talking about both of those themes. But these ones on the right-hand side are only talking about moral discourses, but not this other code, and vice versa. So that's a way that I can quickly and visually see the similarities and the differences based on a code. And you can do that not just based on codes, but based on all kinds of other things. So mapping allows you to interrogate and then visually capture and present those kinds of connections. And there are many other different ways of doing that. So this is, I'm just going to show you a few different visualizations of maps from a variety of different software programs there, just to show you that there are a whole host of different visualizations to explore. And this one is illustrating, this is from MaxQDA, this is from a project I did fairly recently, looking at the impacts of a particular program, when the core impacts and their frequency are illustrated by these thicker lines. But we've also got, again, instances of some of those concepts out here in the data. And also I'm starting to remind myself here, just by in a visual map, making a note to myself that I need to review these data because I'm not sure that these things are really clear yet. So I'm using a map as a way of capturing reflections in that way as well. Okay, I'm running out of time. So those are the main things I wanted to say. Apart from that, I think it's useful if you're interested in this topic and want to explore it in more detail. There's an article by Woods and colleagues from 2015 that talks specifically about the impact and use of CAQDAS packages for reflective practice and reflexivity. So that's a really excellent article to have a look at. They review 3 decades worth of literature on CAQDAS use and report on the different reflexive moments that researchers who use software discuss in their articles. So that's really useful article if you want to look at this in a little bit more detail, and the references at the end of the slides, which I'll share with you. Okay, just to finish up very quickly, why it matters. Okay, for me, it matters because I want and need and should be evidencing my process. Okay, historically, qualitative researchers have not been very good, in my opinion, at telling other people how they got from their pile of qualitative data to the account. And one of the reasons why we haven't been very good at that historically is because we haven't been able to show other people what we do. When we were working manually, all the bits of paper are all over the place. It's very difficult to illustrate and discuss and talk about how we did it. Yes, as soon as you use a CAQDAS package, whichever one it is, you're able to show that process in a concrete way. And that's really, really important, both for myself as a researcher, as I'm going through the process to document my own process so that I can write up my methodology, but also because I want to be able to share what I've done with others so that they can draw upon it. Okay. And also those of us who are teachers, we want to be able to teach other people how to do it well. Okay. So for those reasons, it's really, really important to capture our reflections, whether they're reflexive or not, in order to be able to talk about these things much more. And we are continually criticized, qualitative researchers, and we also need to take responsibility for mitigating those criticisms by actually saying, okay, this is what we actually do, and this is why it is rigorous. Okay, and I think that the idea of capturing reflections and how CAQDAS packages can contribute to that is a really important thing that we should take much more ownership of. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Here are the references. I will send you the slides when I send the recording out later on. But let me just stop my share so that I can see you all a little bit better. And I will have a quick look at the chat and see if there are any questions. Just for the last few minutes. Would you say mapping is what quantitative researchers refer to as a conceptual framework? Oh, that's a really interesting question. Not necessarily. So I think the idea of a conceptual framework is something that we talk about in qualitative research as well as quantitative research. So mapping is more to do with visually representing how things are connected, and that can be something that happens both, across that methodological paradigm. So in quantitative projects, that might happen too, but in qualitative projects, that might be part of the analytic process as well as part of designing a conceptual framework. So I would argue that all projects of any type have a conceptual framework. It's just that some projects have a more what's the word, a more thought through and more refined and more solid conceptual framework at the beginning of the project than others. So when you're on that more purist end of the qualitative spectrum, then your conceptual framework may be much looser, yes, and maybe part of the process of what you're doing in your project is to refine that, but you still have a conceptual framework. I don't know if that helps. I've got some writings about conceptual frameworks I could share, but I see conceptual framework as quite a general term. And so, for example, a theoretical framework, I would argue, is a type of conceptual framework. So a conceptual frame, the way I think about it is a conceptual framework is just a set of concepts that is related in some way. So you might have multiple conceptual frameworks in your project. Does that answer your question? I'll just have a look at the other questions. It does, great. Okay, any specific software you have a preference for in general or for mapping? Okay, really good question, Carla. So some CAQDAS packages have those mapping tools embedded within them, but not all. And mapping means something quite different in some programs from others. So what I would normally say is mapping, as I've discussed it today, is normally a little bit of an add-on in these programs. So these CAQDAS programs are not mapping software programs. Okay, they are qualitative data analysis programs, and a small part of the tools that they provide are mapping tools. So if you're seriously into mapping, then you may find that actual mapping tools are more useful for you. But the benefit of the mapping tools inside the CAQDAS packages is that they're integrated with the rest of the data. So when I have a code or a data source inside a map and I'm making a link, I can access that data source and I can access the data inside that code from the map. And that's really the benefit of the mapping tools in the CAQDAS packages. So they're a little bit clunky and they're not as powerful as actual bespoke mapping tools. But because they're integrated with the rest of your data, it goes back to that whole container idea. So I mean, there's lots of mapping software. I use Xmind. So when I'm planning out something, for example, I use Xmind quite a lot when I'm planning out an article or a textbook that I want to write or something. But as soon as I want to generate a map from my actual data, then I go to my qualitative software and do it in there. Ros asks a good question. How should you talk about reflection and reflexivity in a paper? Well, my honest answer to that, Ros, is in the way that you think about it, right? Everybody will talk about reflection and reflexivity in a different way. And hopefully one of the things I tried to do earlier on is to show you that actually these things mean a variety of different things. So what we have to do as a qualitative researcher is position ourselves within that whole landscape and decide what it means to us. Yes, by reference to the literature. I'm using these terms in this way, but not that way for this reason. And therefore, that's what I'm doing. And that's what I would always say about anything to do with qualitative methodology. There's so much that goes on that all you can do is contextualize what you believe in that landscape. Because there will always be someone who says, Ros, you should be thinking about it like this. There will always be someone who says that. There will always be someone who criticizes you. So all you can do is know for yourself what you think is the right thing for this particular project and be able to justify that. That's all you can ever do, I think, and be confident about that. And, you know, the worst thing that we worry about, isn't it, is that we present something at a conference and someone says, oh, that's rubbish, Ros, it's rubbish. You should have done it like this. Yeah, that's the thing we worry about most. Yeah. Even those of us who've been doing it for years and years and years, we still worry about that. But the response to that is always, oh, that's really interesting. if I'd have been looking at my research topic from this perspective, then yes, but I'm looking at it from this perspective, and from this perspective, I believe this, and this is appropriate, and therefore, whatever. Yeah, because there will always be, because of that spectrum idea, there will always be someone that says, you're doing it wrong. Always. Yeah. So all you can ever do is say, this is the context within which I'm doing it. This is the reason I'm doing it like that. And therefore, of course, I could look at it somehow different. And that's also valuable. But I've decided for these reasons to look at it like this. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. We've run out of time, but let's just see what's going on in the chat. Would you advise that we include images from semantic? I think you should definitely use images to illustrate your writings. Definitely. I think it's really powerful. But you also need to think about who your audience is, right? So some audiences will react differently to certain types of visualization. So get to know your audience and speak to your audience is what I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. I actually had an experience during my undergraduate in Nigeria that one of my professors complained about having images. He said I should have just explained what those things meant and not flood my writings with images. So
yeah,
that was why I asked.
It's a different perspective, isn't it? So I think it's, if I'm reading a research paper and it's only text, then after a while I get bored. I want to see something that's engaged. It's a similar thing I said to Roz, isn't it? Everybody has a different opinion. So all you can do is think about these things and understand the variety and then make your own decision and then stand by it. Yeah. I can't really see what else we can do, right? Because it's such, qualitative research is not homogenous. It's a very varied thing, and there will always be people who have a different way of thinking about it. So all you can do is try to be as confident in what you're doing as possible. And that's to do with understanding what it is and then saying, okay, that's very interesting. However, I think this.
I suppose there isn't a right way of doing any of it, is there?
No.
You just have to pick your path and stick to it.
Absolutely. And if anybody says to you, qualitative research is this, it's not. Qualitative research is a massive thing. There is not, there are many, many really, really famous and qualitative researchers and methodologists who I greatly admire, but who say qualitative research is this one thing, right? Okay, that's what they think, fine. But actually, in my career over the last 30 years, I've met loads and loads of qualitative researchers who are doing something completely different from that one thing. Yeah. And who am I to say that that's not right? We should be open to all of the different ways of understanding the world. And that, for me, that's what qualitative research brings, is that openness. Anyway, that's just my opinion.
Thank you. It's been really, really great.
You're welcome. I'm happy to hang around if anybody wants to hang around and ask questions. You're happy to open. I'm losing track of the chat slightly now, but if anybody wants to open their audio and just have a chat, I'm quite happy to do that. Simple Mind Pro. I haven't checked that out, Sharon. I will do. Thank you for the. Yeah, Xmind. That's the one I use, Carla. There is a tension between different perspectives. I'm still struggling about it. How do I overcome this problem? Yeah, I know. I think, yeah, there is a tension, and there always will be. And the only way you can overcome it is I think, as the way I've said, is to just own it yourself, and to. It's easy to say. You've been doing it for a long time, but.
Sorry, because I'm quite worried preparing for my paper, because it's quite different culture. It's hard to present different. So I'm still not sure if it's, I don't know, fit with the different culture background. Do you have any tips or suggestions?
So Have you
to profile.
You're preparing for your Viva, so you have already submitted your
No,
thesis?
not yet.
Not
I'm
yet.
still
Okay.
working on the manuscript.
Okay.
But yeah.
I would say from now on and after you have submitted, what you need to do is to read through your thesis and anticipate all of the criticisms. So read it as if you were somebody who didn't agree and think, what might they ask me? Yeah. So that you have in your mind what the potential criticisms are, so that you can then prepare your answer.
Okay.
That's a difficult thing to do, okay, because you feel like, oh, but if you can, I would wait until you've submitted your thesis. So submit your thesis, have a celebration. I've submitted my thesis. 2 weeks later, okay, look at it again with as much as an objective view as possible and think, okay, if I was somebody who was in a completely different, a quantitative person or whatever, what would I say with the criticisms, and list all the things, and then you can build up what your answers to those criticisms might be.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
I asked a question in the chat already, but you probably lost track of it.
I might have missed it. Tell me.
Yeah, so I'm a grad student. I'm originally from Nigeria. I'm in the US, and I have used Atlas TI a little bit before I came in here. But when I got here and I was trying to write my thesis, I found out that there was no professor that had an idea of Atlas TI. So I was forced to use MassQDA. So right now I'm a little bit confused, and I'm trying to look at which one is the greatest. Like for me, I've used Atlas TI more than MassQDA. I'm just wondering. Because I'm trapped between making a decision that people here where I am presently, because I just graduated with a master's. I'm starting my PhD in fall. So I'm still trapped between that decision of choosing which one to go with as far as data analytic tools. Of course, it's not a bad idea to know more. I wish to do, but I just want to have strength in maybe one or two. So what would you advise?
My advice would be related to your project. Okay, so if you have access to both of those programs, and there's no practical decision making in terms of cost or anything, then I would say to you, okay, let's have a conversation about what your research is about, and particularly what your analysis needs to do. And then I could advise you on which software would be most suitable to that analytic approach. And I'd be happy to have that conversation with you, not now, but another time. If you wanted to email me, we could do that.
Of course, I'm open to that. I like mentorship, so I can take your email. So that would be great.
So just get in touch with me, and then we can. It's not an easy question to answer right now, because I think it depends on your project.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll reach out.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. So I think we're probably coming to the end of our time. It's Friday. I don't know where you all are in the world, but it's Friday evening here. So I'm going to sign off. I will try to load the video up onto the YouTube channel early next week and send that to you all with the slides. Do get in touch if you have any follow-up questions or reflections or anything like that. Always happy to help. But I hope you found it interesting.